What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. If you're not a subscriber, then simply welcome to the channel. I got a little bit of a location change. I hope you guys feel okay with it. I think this is a little bit more comfy, and I think that maybe that white background was kind of just too sterile. Made me feel like I was in like a mental house. Anyways, today's video is going to be on the future of fashion. Where has fashion gone, and where will it end up? I put a poll out on Instagram pretty much asking you guys what would be the preferred topic for me to make a video on, and this actually won out. So here we go. When I first got into fashion, it was the era of Supreme, Hood by Air, Double Taps, Bape, Rick Owens, and APC times Kanye West. It was an era that led up to another more infamous era. We all know it today as the Hype Beast era. That 2010 through 2013 predecessor era to the Hypebeast era, I think really is where I developed my actual love and taste for fashion. If I had to note what exactly drew me into fashion in that era and what was important to me, among the many things that I could list, I'd say the most important things were how that era of clothing, that era of streetwear, street goth, so on and so forth, could communicate a sense of luxuriousness, a luster, or just like a sense of exclusivity through just a graphic t-shirt or a Pyrex hoodie. There are some key important reasonings and factors behind why a contemporary modern art urban brand masquerading as a skate shop could sell out entire collections within like minutes or seconds sometimes. One reason they were able to communicate that luxury and exclusiveness to people like me was because they were able to bridge the gap in between the lower end brands like Mallcore Skate and then the higher brands like Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and so on and so forth. Brands like Supreme took the approach of a modern art gallery, showcasing things that were essentially streetwear or reminded you of something lower end, but of course with a little bit more of an artistic tape. Using a mixture of artists like Barbara Kruger and local skaters like Mark Gonzalez, they were able to sort of bridge that gap in a way that no one had really ever done before. Again, more like a modern contemporary brand posing as a skate brand, which was a cool idea in and of itself, as it was an early predecessor to the sort of idea of street luxe. Along with Bape and Double Taps and lots of other Japanese streetwear brands, they were kind of bringing the masses into a sort of a more well-dressed, more aware sort of state of mind. And of course, everything was done with a slightly higher level of quality. I remember being blown away by the Supreme hoodies specifically. Although the t-shirts were nicer than your standard Mallcore brand, I think the hoodies just hit another note. Of course, the box logo era was underway, but I think there was something to it about the higher quality feel, the rough exterior, and the soft fleece brushed lined inside of the hoodies that kind of differentiated themselves from other brands, especially some of the Mallcore brands. Everything you bought from Supreme felt better quality, felt more well made, felt more substantial, which gave you that feeling of a luxe purchase. The presentation, however, was pretty much anything but that. An open concept design to the shop meant people can just ride in and skate, just like they were just off of the streets and coming to any other skate shop. But the level of attention to detail, the quality, and the referencing to the subject matters of New York and New York skate, as well as streetwear, was something that just wasn't really seen or common in that era. By all means, that era of Supreme was probably its peak. Fast forward today, brands don't even talk about their quality. They don't talk about craftsmanship or construction at all. That used to be something that we sold things on. That used to be the selling point of a lot of brands back then. Now, what was really important for that era, as far as the broader scheme of fashion, is that it was going to pretty much set the precedence for the era that's going to come after it, which is what we're living in today. Now, that trend was not necessarily set for the masses or for the consumer, maybe a little bit, but more importantly, it was set for the industry. Fashion houses known for couture and tailoring were going to begin to manufacture, design, and market clothes that were adjacent to some of the styles that you would see in the lower income parts of most cities, or what we would call the inner city, where streetwear was birthed. Brands like Celine and Louis Vuitton, Balenciaga, and so on were going to begin to manufacture oversized, baggy, and trendy clothing. It's important to note that the appreciation and the low-key appropriation of the streetwear aesthetic had not reached what we know it for today. Streetwear isn't necessarily a stranger to the runway. However, brands essentially would quietly appropriate styles that were popular in the inner city and lower income neighborhoods of the United States and actually all over the world. Black and Latino who lived in the inner city would often set the styles and the trends that you would later see on the runway. However, again, they were quietly appropriated, and the communities that actually started those trends and those styles would be left out of the equation, which is the whole issue with appropriation in the first place. Meanwhile, the fashion industry will continue to thrive and profit from these styles. It's actually quite interesting to note that at one point in time, Supreme got a smooth and swift cease and desist letter from Louis Vuitton themselves because they made a look-alike box logo design that featured something that was similar to, but not necessarily the same as, their monogram design. Luckily, Supreme essentially had a model of release and renew, meaning that they would release something but never really re-release it afterwards. So by the time they got that letter, it was rumored at least that Supreme had already stopped producing that design, so it really was no consequence to them. However, that letter ensured that they can no longer re-release that design, at least not to that same effect. But all of a sudden, circa the Virgil Abloh Off-White Duchamp-esque design takeover that he initiated, Supreme, seemingly in a full circle moment, reached out to Supreme, or maybe Supreme reached out to them for what became an official collaboration between the two brands, which I think is really what opened the floodgates to the downward integration of fashion that we saw. Soon, brands, like I said before, were beginning to create streetwear looks like oversized hoodies, oversized everything essentially, baggy pants, and so on and so forth, and even Jordan look-alike shoes on the runway, as you can see in Virgil's Louis Vuitton. But with this Supreme Louis Vuitton, the Kim Jones appointment at Dior, we start to see this trickle down or downward effect kind of sped up into super speed, if you want to be honest. By this point, I'm thinking that it's gotten pretty stale, as the idea of creating a streetwear look at a luxury quality level and a closer to luxury price tag was not really something that we hadn't heard of, as we're familiar with Bape and Double Tap's Mastermind even, which was an early predecessor before the Virgil Off-White era. But before I go off on a rant about that, let's stick to the main topic of the video, which is that new downward integration, that sort of envelopment of the new look, as I think we can coin it now. Of course, again, to us, it's not a new look at all, but the idea of the higher end fashion brands swooping up designers from the streetwear scene or people who are in that streetwear space to now come and create streetwear looks for a huge industry that had essentially shunned streetwear and not taken it seriously before. I mean, for that to happen, I would say, I don't know, it's kind of crazy. It's something unorthodox that we hadn't necessarily really expected to go down in the way that it did go down to such a large effect. As we all know, at some point in 2017, the Kering Group, or more specifically Balenciaga, quickly hired Vetements designer and founder Demna Gvasalia to be their creative director and head designer of the menswear side of Balenciaga. Now, this is where it really gets interesting, because before this, Demna Gvasalia had been heralded while at Vetements as one of the first designers, if not the first designer, to actually understand the internet. If you ask me, in my humble opinion, I think Demna Gvasalia was probably the, if not one of the first designers to create garments that essentially were supposed to go viral. And by that I mean the garments seemingly were created exactly and specifically for the purpose of breaking the internet. This is pretty much a built-in marketing ploy, but also it was the product. The product marketing itself was a genius idea. That's essentially what him and Gauram were doing at Vetements. So you can kind of see how at this point he had already implemented this strategy that, again, he may not have created on his own, but he was pretty much known for at the time. They even got your boy Hedi Slimane to sort of hop on that train, as I'm pretty sure if it was just him by himself, him left his own devices, Hedi Slimane would probably not necessarily bend to the will of the industry, but since he was under contract and hired to do a job, and I think he did it well. You can see a lot of the Celine looks kind of reminiscent of that same idea. Of course, not exactly to the same effect as Balenciaga, but again, the idea of the street wear or urban look had followed and penetrated throughout the fashion industry. Slowly but surely, fashion had become a shell of its former self, at least a shell of what I knew it as, a shell that has succumbed eventually to the long developing cracks present in its surface. This online algorithm based design philosophy and implementation has essentially turned fashion into a giant Shein factory. Prices are rising and rising and rising, yet the design and quality has stagnated. It seems like sensationalism is more important at this point than quality and uniqueness. Now, I'm no psychic, and so I can't necessarily predict the future. However, by studying the past and the present, I feel like I can come up with some sort of prediction. One thing that I have noticed is that the fashion heads, not just the casual consumer, but the real enthusiasts, the obsessive types, and the brands that they've tended to start wearing at this point have kind of dialed back into a more conservative sense of style. And by conservative, I mean more monochromatic, minimalist, drawn back. Now, there are multiple reasons for this shift in the fashion industry, but one of those reasons has to be a focus on quality over quantity and sensationalism. Now, this may not be true yet for the masses and the fashion industry as a whole, but most things that tend to shift or change the fashion zeitgeist start with the smaller, more like OG fashion heads, enthusiasts, the people who are really down for fashion because they're a part of the culture and have likely always been. That being said, the people who are really on top of it are going to start moving towards this direction or already have moved towards this direction before the larger majority of people who are interested, even if in passing, in fashion. Now, I'll quickly note that conservatism in your style or design does not necessarily indicate inherent better quality or craftsmanship or construction. However, you would hope that with less gimmick and less sensationalism, that the only thing left to sell your brand or clothing or whatever it is that you sell is quality. Now, that being said, I hesitate to tell you that fashion will revert back to the 2011 through 2018 version of itself, which some people may be happy about, some people may be upset about. You gotta understand that sometimes a change tends to be permanent, or at least the effects of that change tend to ripple throughout time in a certain niche industry or even a broader industry. YSL or Yves Saint Laurent introduced the ready to wear off the rack model of buying clothes, as fashion had always been something for the rich and couture buyers of the world. Ready to wear introduced pretty much designer clothing as we know it today to the lower income masses. Now, of course, everyone isn't going to hop on that, expensive, like overpriced Parisian look. But people who were interested into fashion at the time, who could only live out their fantasies through pictures and magazines, were now able to, if they had the money, of course, go into the store and purchase something off the rack. Now, Yves Saint Laurent died before I was even born, so you have to understand that this had happened quite a while ago. I mean, multiple decades ago, like 50 years ago, maybe. But the important thing is to note that that essentially changed fashion forever, and we still see off the rack purchasing today. So, that being said, this integration of urban and street, this false scarcity model that streetwear essentially came up with, that has trickled into the fashion industry, this oversized or like extravagantly priced opulent look that is a caricature of the original inspiration, which was urban wear, probably in some way, shape, or form will have a lasting effect on the fashion industry. Or maybe it means that the model of selling clothes, of the drop method like Supreme used to do, may come back. I mean, whether or not it means either one of those things or neither one of those things, essentially the point is that it will some way, shape, or form affect the future of fashion, however that may be. This is leading into really the climax of this talking point. But I think that there's always sort of a two-party or maybe even one-party system that's going to take precedence over whatever social group or subculture or larger, wider culture that you may be talking about. You're going to have a group of people that will continue to push fashion forward, who will continue to be on the fringes of even a fringe group like fashion. And I believe those people are going to be the ones who push that minimalism or contemporary style forward, or maybe evolve it into something else. But I would say the more interesting of the two, because it's the more unpredicted one of the two, is that there's probably going to be a group of people that essentially enjoy fashion the way it is because the main point of it is probably flying over their heads and they're not necessarily in it for the same reason. That problem kind of comes along with introducing something that was niche and concentrated to a larger, like huge group of people. Gatekeeping has actually sort of made a sort of small but noticeable comeback, as I believe people who are fashion heads, who are really like into it, are kind of like getting tired of the masses diluting something that they love. And even some of the newer school people are beginning to gatekeep some of the newer brands, even though that they're not really making a huge impact right now, is interesting to see. See that group that's kind of happy with the status quo, I guess, the way things are now. Again, people are probably younger in this group, and people are probably really not going to remember the way fashion used to be. They're probably going to continue to consume lower quality yet sensational clothing that signal wealth to the lower income people that they are probably surrounded with, and that's no shade to them. I guess you could call me the lower income bracket as well, so of course there's no shade, but you understand that most people in that tax bracket are not necessarily really looking into fashion or what's hot or whatever. They're kind of just wearing something that they think looks relatively good. And that's always been around, except I think that that group of people are going to be a little bit more privy to trends and a little bit more privy to what's popping or whatever. So the trick of the fashion industry now is to try and convince these people that what they're buying is the newest, hottest thing, when the actual tastemakers or the actual like fashion heads, the people who you would consider like really into fashion, have probably moved on. I think even at this point currently, we've already moved on from that. The loud logo mania aspect of fashion that existed in the 90s and came back around, of course, in the late 2010s, the 2020s, is going to probably consume them in a sort of a way. And then when that goes away and when that becomes less popular, I don't know what would rear its ugly head after that. But I think essentially that group of people is going to continue to buy into that sort of urban mixed with high fashion idea, albeit the quality and the high fashion aspect may not be what the fashion brands of the future or the current brands of today will focus on. I think the new version of the helmet lungs are going to take over. I think the Cotier, or I can't even pronounce that brand, but the brand that makes the little strange looking bag. I'll post a picture on the screen somewhere. I guess I'm not as into fashion as I thought because I can't remember the damn name of the brand. I think the idea of quiet luxury is going to appeal to this new faction of people because, of course, quiet luxury is more the if you know, you know sort of space. Now, that's just a way of gatekeeping without really gatekeeping, because if people don't exactly know what you have on or there's no logo, they're not going to ask about it anyway. But someone who's really, really into it is going to know just based off of a shape, a silhouette, a design, a certain material choice, kind of like how Bottega is famous for the weaving of the leather in their bags. In conclusion, the perception of fashion really hasn't changed for most people, even though I let you know all that. It's essentially still functioning in a more niche space than we would really like to think, as far as those who are really into fashion. I think most people regard fashion or expensive, like high quality clothing as essentially unimportant because, of course, we're in an economic crisis amongst the working class, and probably more than just the American working class. It's probably more of a Western thing. It could be affecting the world, but as an ignorant American, I don't really know much about how our economics are affecting the East. That we're going to try and separate ourselves from that mass market as much as possible. There's a sort of elitism and sort of like a snobbery in that mindset, but that's always kind of existed in fashion, and I feel like there's a reason why. If you really look at it, the internet is essentially driving consumerism at this point. Again, 10 years ago, it wasn't like this at this level, but now it's just pretty much a normalized thing. It's no longer new or niche or just like unheard of. It's absolutely a norm now. Like, internet sensationalism, virality of a certain brand or clothing item is essentially driving a fashion brand at this point. If you can't make something that pretty much goes viral, the mass markets are not really going to be into it. But it's also hard to break into that like smaller but more dedicated market of real fashion enthusiasts. So if you're trying to make a brand, that might be something to take note of. But essentially, that's my prediction for how fashion will continue to evolve and change and what may become of it in the near future. If you do like this video, please like, subscribe, and of course, follow me on IG. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, if there's something I could change. Maybe there's a topic that you want to talk about. I would definitely be down with that. Hit me up in the comment section or DM on Instagram. Thank you for the support, and thanks for watching the video.